The administration's national security strategy, the Department of War's subordinate national defense strategy, and the Department of State's strategic plan all point to the value, both to the United States and to the region, of increased U.S. attention to the Western Hemisphere. And the document also asserts the Don Roe doctrine of denying extra-hemispheric control of key resources, facilities, and terrain by adversarial regimes or their proxies. The strategies also, I think very wisely, elevate America's economic and commercial interests and power to equal footing with military and diplomatic influence, one of the best features of the current administration as compared with all others, even the Trump 45 administration in which I worked. And further, these strategies offer renewed bilateral and multilateral relationships to achieve shared goals of regional security, stability, and prosperity. So in 2025 and then continuing into 2026, the Caribbean has seen heightened U.S. activity, including Secretary Rubio's first overseas trip, which came less than 1 month into his tenure, military operations Southern Spear and Absolute Resolve, primary and secondary sanctions against the illegitimate Venezuelan regime's oil trade, substantial impact on Cuba there, followed up with the Shield of the Americas Summit and the establishment of the Americas Counter-Cartel Coalition, the AC3. Supporters, both domestic and regional, view this as an America first, not America alone hemispheric security policy. So, Andres, can you give us just an opening minute or two on what you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities in the region given current threats and environment?
I think the biggest challenges that we have are not going to surprise anyone. It's narco-trafficking, the proliferation of narco-terrorist organizations, the weakening of institutions and capacities of local governments, regional governments to confront those challenges, and the movement also, particularly for the United States, of malign extra-hemispheric actors in Latin America in particular, and that very much is rising as a concern as we see potentials for future conflict with China, for example, where what will the Chinese control of ports or other critical infrastructure within our hemisphere, what will that mean and how will that be leveraged by China? And there's a reason that they're so interested in that. They see the Western Hemisphere as a strategic venue for their capacities against the United States, and they want to preserve that.
So, Art, if you could give us a minute or two on your views of what's happening in the Caribbean of late.
One of the things coming from my experience in Special Forces and SOF is the irregular warfare and hybrid elements that have taken place in the Americas since 9/11. As the war on terror geared up in September 11 of 2001, the United States and every administration since took their eye off its backyard. And other actors, near-peer competitors and narco-terrorists moved into that space and exploited it, and have exploited it. We saw a resurgence of 22 nations that joined a socialist organization known as El ALBA. Right now there's 21. Milei very smartly pulled Argentina out of it. The Caribbean, many of these small islands are still members of ALBA, for example. So this administration, thankfully, has come on board, realized there's a threat to the homeland, Puerto Rico being the most southern border that the United States has. In conjunction with CBP, DHS, and other federal agencies, we have disrupted significantly the flow of narcotics through Puerto Rico to the mainland, to the point where some of these cartels are having to ship narcotics to Europe and then find ways to cross it from Europe across the Atlantic back to the U.S. via Canada. It took this administration coming back into office to realize that, number one, the threat to the homeland is the Caribbean, it is the Americas, and how do we consolidate and how do we prevent that from continuing to fester in the hemisphere?
Mark, your initial thoughts.
So I'll start off by saying I love sports, but I hate playing chase. And for the past 35 years, it seemed like as a nation, we've been chasing these cartels, and we're always been a step behind. They used to fly airplanes over the Bahamas and drop drugs. We countered that. They started using Go Fast. We learned how to shoot the engines out, stopping that. Use drug submarines. We figured that out. But again, always one step ahead. And I think as a nation, we're really at an inflection point now, because I think as you read the national security strategy, national defense strategy, the priority is on the Western Hemisphere and dismantling transnational criminal organizations and providing Southcom, the Congress is going to have something to say about this, but providing Southcom with the resources that they need to get the mission done. That's unprecedented for folks like us who have been around in a little while. So I think there's an opportunity to stop chasing and maybe be a little predictive and get ahead of our adversary. And I would just put 3 things out there quickly. We could talk more about them later, but from my perspective operationally, I think there's 3 things you really need to do. First, we need to modernize our detection and monitoring capabilities from the seabed to space. Second is data. We talked about intelligence a lot in the last conference, the El Mencho one, and I don't think it's so much an intelligence problem. There's a lot of intelligence. It's a data integration problem. And data is the coin of the realm. And whoever can systematically collect it, aggregate it, process it, exploit it, and disseminate it will have a decision-making advantage over their adversary. But you need to do it in real time. It needs to be across domains, across jurisdictions, and then we can move a little faster. And then the third thing is empowering our partner nations. We have some willing and very capable partner nations, some more than others, but we need to give them the tools so that they can assume some of the burden off of us and be true partners in this fight.
Nicolás Maduro didn't apparently read or heed the messages that were sent, implicit and explicit, verbal and nonverbal, that were sent toward him by the Trump administration throughout 2025. What do you think of the impact of the messages transmitted? How has their behavior and rhetoric changed, if at all, after seeing what happened to Maduro?
When we're looking at messaging, we have to, again, recognize the disengagement that the U.S. has had with the Western Hemisphere for years and years, decades. For decades, there wasn't a credible level of engagement from the United States, whether it's with partners and allies or in confronting many of the adversaries which have built up a foothold, whether it's in Venezuela or Cuba or elsewhere. There really wasn't a sense from these adversaries that the United States is actually going to act on or confront these threats in any serious way. And I think that's why it's so crucial that first with the boat strikes that we saw last year in the Caribbean, the Trump administration showing the region, showing these adversaries, these narco-terrorist organizations, that the United States is going to act in its defense, in defending the American people and confronting these threats. And the Trump administration, President Trump, took that to the next level with the capture of Nicolás Maduro. And I think that's an important signal not only to the rest of the regime's remnants in Venezuela, but to the region more broadly. Now these adversaries know the reality. These organizations, these narco-terrorist organizations as well, they're having to respond. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of challenges in Cuba with respect to the path there and those talks.
So Operation Southern Spear, the boat strikes, and absolute resolve to capture Maduro relied on significant reactivation of dormant or near dormant bases and facilities in Puerto Rico with the explicit and very public support of the governor, who appeared alongside Secretary Hegseth and others in supporting the troops involved in those missions. So, Mark, your chance to talk about Southern Spear and boat strikes. And there's been a lot of talk about the legality of lethal strikes against drug trafficking vessels. The administration asserts that they're narco-terrorists attacking the U.S. and our citizens, essentially as proxy militias executing missions that serve adversarial regimes and affiliated or complicit paramilitary terrorist organizations. So for the purposes of this question, let's assume that all that's true and that the strikes are legal. So what's your assessment on the practical impact, the deterrent value, and as you already alluded to, the partner nation operational relationships that Operation Southern Spear has had so far?
As a military officer, and I think we'd all say the same thing, once the president designates one of these organizations as a terrorist organization, it unleashes a host of authorities, and that's really what you need to have from a military perspective to execute the mission. So that's that from a military perspective. Now, backing up a little bit and thinking about it strategically, if the ultimate goal is to dismantle these transnational criminal organizations, which I think it is, then we really need to think about when is it appropriate that we want to do a kinetic strike on a vessel and have it go away, and when do you want to take law enforcement action to maybe bring those people into the U.S. legal system, those smugglers off the boat into the U.S. legal system. It needs to be a conscious decision with the end in mind of we want to dismantle this organization. So if you know that this boat is connected to another organization, maybe you want to do law enforcement on that. So you can bring those people in, interview them, see what kind of intelligence you can get from them. And then the other side of it is these boats, for as rudimentary as they are, if you see some of these boats, they're open hull construction, about 30 feet long, 3 or 4 individuals in there. But when they're out there, they have cell phones, they have satellite phones, they have GPS, they usually have a couple of phone numbers in their pockets. That is tremendously valuable intelligence. And so when you make that interdiction, if you can take that information and quickly exploit it, get it back into the targeting cycle as quickly as possible, you might be able to find the next contact in the water, or the next target on the water. When I was in uniform, I thought about, if you're familiar with what General McChrystal did in the mid-2000s, we were fighting Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and he came up with a program called F3EA, Find, Fix, Finish, Exploit, and Analyze. And what that was is he sent his special forces folks around, I'm sure are very familiar with this, they would go into the caves, and if they could capture the people, more important was the information, was the computers, the laptops, the phones, and then rapidly, in real time, exploitation of that so fast that it was getting to the point where that same SEAL team or Rangers or whoever they were would go to another target that same night. That's when you're starting to move faster than the adversary, and you can really get ahead of their decision-making cycle and put them on the defensive instead of us. So I think keeping that end state in mind of, hey, we want to dismantle these organizations, then when is it appropriate to do kinetic, when is it appropriate to do law enforcement, and making that conscious decision.
Those are all great points. And one of my longtime criticisms of the methodology that we used was almost every case was funneling toward a U.S. federal Department of Justice-led prosecution, which is not in itself a bad thing, but it creates a funnel of information that is closed, and that information doesn't get back out into the field in the way that you described. So, Andres, now I want to go to you, and I know that this question doesn't have a single answer. We have 34 next-door neighbors just in the Caribbean alone, but what's been the public, press, and political reception of the first year of the administration, the boat strikes, the Maduro situation, the Shield of the Americas Summit, the counter-cartel coalition, so much activity? How is it being received downrange?
Yeah, I think in general it's been overwhelmingly positive. Certainly there are agitators, and there's a far left movement within Latin America, which is going to be very much opposed to the U.S. being active in Latin America. But when we look at the situation that President Trump's kind of refocus on the Western Hemisphere, what that was looking like, it was a crisis in Ecuador, where once peaceful country was now in the wave of narco violence. Haiti on the brink, 100,000 dead Americans from fentanyl every year, and the cartels more powerful than ever. Colombia, a similar situation there with the empowerment of those narco guerrillas. And the mass migration crisis, the Tren de Aragua, which not only affected the United States, but cities across Latin America. And the people in Latin America, I think, got a full view of, A, the policies of the left, which is in much of Latin America was generating these conditions, but also the disengagement of the United States with these security threats. And the consequences were chaos and crisis. I think that's why you saw there was, ahead of this operation that President Trump did to capture Nicolás Maduro, there was actually a majority, polling showing that a majority of Latin Americans wanted the U.S. military to confront the Maduro regime, because they were dealing with the consequences of that regime. And now you see, I think, the positive view of U.S. engagement being continued to be revealed through elections across Latin America, where you have voters voting into office, conservative, pro-U.S. leaders that run many times on an explicit platform of engaging with the United States, alignment with the United States and the Trump administration. I think that's as clear a message as you can get as to the way the voters in Latin America, citizens in Latin America, and political leadership in the region sees in a very positive way this engagement of the United States. There's this history with many countries of engaging with China because of the economic opportunities there as well. But I think, A, because that offering that China offers is, at the end of the day, it's a false offering. But also, B, because of just the alignment culturally, economically, and politically that much of Latin America has with the United States. The U.S. is the natural and preferred partner, and you hear that time and time again when you engage with officials in the region. There's multiple engagements, and there's real progress being brought to bear that also benefits the region as a result of those meetings and as a result of that engagement.
And it's a common feature across the globe that when the countries that are closest to the threat are the ones that like America the most. Speaking of adversary action, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands present both opportunity and risk. Venezuela being the most acute, but infiltration of our neighbors, especially economically and politically smaller island nations that are vulnerable because of their kind of poor resourcing. Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, Dominica, they're vulnerable to this kind of diplomatic and economic penetration by China. What's your and the governor's perspective on the ability of Puerto Rico to push back against that and then to project positive American influence in the region, particularly to the east?
Puerto Rico is the United States. This is our nation. And we are that aircraft carrier in the Caribbean from which we can project our national interests. And that's what the governor wants to do. And right now, if you look at, you mentioned Antigua and Barbuda, we're talking about $1.8 billion Chinese investment. It is a Chinese economic free zone, and there were Chinese Coast Guard cutters there. In Jamaica, you're talking about $1 billion of Chinese investment, state investment. When I'm talking investment, I'm talking about state investment. I think now, if you noticed since the Maduro event, all they offer now is rhetoric. We've understood very clearly that once again the United States has become the preeminent power in the hemisphere, and they're moving to take back the backyard, to put attention in the Americas and in the Western Hemisphere. And now we're affecting their national security interests, which were not necessarily in the Caribbean. So they're having to pull back. They're having to reassess. They are seriously looking at, in Russia's case, Ukraine, the High North. In China's case, they're looking back now at the South China Sea, Taiwan, the High North. So it is definitely in the interest of the administration to continue to project from Puerto Rico in conjunction with the assets that we can afford into the region